Thank you, Jimmy and Tim. Now it's time for questions. Okay, as a start, I would like to ask the first question for Mr. Jia. 贾总，就是
So, Mr. Jia, so you mentioned that it is very complicated to have an integrated high-rise project, and for the developer, of course, you want to save the budget and you would like to make profit in the future. So my question is that, so if for this complex, so maybe it should not be a skyscraper. Well, for Greenland company, I know that you have already built, or you are ready to build more and more super high-rises complex. What are the reasons for that? You still want to do these super tall buildings? So I think, yeah, for Greenland company, so I think we are one of the earliest developers in the skyscraper, and actually we have quite a large number of skyscraper or super tall buildings. So in this regard, we are relatively mature. Well, in terms of the reason why we advocate the construction of tall buildings, I think this is one of the demand for urban development, because when China has reached a certain level in economic scale, and as one of the urban images, and also some other reasons, and also because actually the city is growing dramatically, so it is the demand for super tall buildings. And in terms of how tall, well, it's difficult to say. I think we are acute in identifying these opportunities. So we are one of the earliest developers to have commercial super tall buildings. I think there is one confusion. Sometimes I believe that maybe height will affect the cost. Yeah, of course, I admit that the cost is one of the influencer. But if the plot ratio can be optimized, actually, yeah, it is also influencing the cost. According to our current experience, so from 200 to 300 meters tall building in the Tier 1 city, the cost may not be higher than a 100-meter tall building with a high plot ratio, because in terms of parking and some other facilities. So I think the cost influence is still very limited for the buildings less than 300 meters. But if it is above 300 meters, 400 and even 500 meters, maybe the cost will be increasing much dramatically for such buildings above 300 meters. So this is my reason for that.
Okay. Other questions from audience? Over there.
It's a question to Mr. Tim Johnson. You mentioned the significance of respecting the specific urban context, and then in the practical project that you presented, you embraced the 90-10 rule, which ended up creating a semi-blueprint with the projects that do not really quite relate to their specific context. So how could you reconcile these two ends?
Well, it's one of our challenges, isn't it? I think a lot of times we're working in cities that have very low densities surrounding them, and we know that the future will be very high densities. I always use the example of New York City, where you see a building from the late 1800s next to a building from the 1900s, and then a building today, and they grow dramatically and they change dramatically. And so I think part of what we're always conscious of is how the buildings that we do will affect the context around them. Adrian Smith pointed out yesterday that a lot of tall buildings aren't profit centers, it's the value of the land that goes up around it, and then the future buildings that go up around it where the profit is made. I think some of the features that we try to employ, like understanding the streetscape, understanding that times are changing. We're certainly not making buildings that have a Chinese aesthetic, if you will, but we're creating an urban infrastructure that allows people to move around them and through them, and also to help understand what might happen on the sites adjacent to them in the future in terms of scale, entry points, access points, etc.
Okay.
Yeah, excellent presentations. Thank you. I'd like to address this to Eton Properties, Mr. Jimmy Cheung or team. And the Xiamen waterfront, it appears that all your livable spaces are on the high ground. I wonder if you consider the rising sea level or tsunamis, because everything below 10 meters appears to be plazas and retail. But the hotel and residential component, they seem to be above the 10-meter rising sea level because of climate change or tsunamis. Was that the design criteria?
Actually, the city has, like many waterfront cities, a datum that you need to build above, right? And who knows how far global warming is going to go beyond some of those criteria that are already there. But we certainly thought about, certainly meeting the criteria, but I think also for a site this close to the water, and there's a fair bit of density on the site, we actually wanted to pull the buildings up and let the city flow through the building. So they kind of work together. The idea of not having living space close to where you might have flooding, but also, more importantly, to let the city run through the site, to let it be more transparent and to let it flow through. I think that was something that the city was also very interested in, is that interaction and not blocking the city from the waterfront.
kumusta? 其实呢，一个项目呢。
Yeah, when it comes to this kind of a project, I think this is not only a developer-related issue. You're also going to have to consider government requirement. So indeed, when we do our work, there are a lot of complicated difficulties.
你好，我是来自
Hello, I'm from Beijing. My question goes to Mr. Jia. If you look at the earthquake-proof requirement, in a kind of a Beijing requirement is to be able to proof against, for example, 8 degrees. And in Shanghai, we have a different requirement. Then what is the construction cost difference to build a building with a height of 200 and 300 meters? All right. First, I would like to say, I was with a background of architecture. I am certainly familiar with the structure, but I cannot go into much detail on structure. For the height between 200 meters to 300 meters, the structural system is already very mature. For example, between 6 degrees on to 8 degrees on, there may be some differences, but it is not very significant. Among super tall buildings, you look at the proportion of the structural cost to the overall cost, the proportion is not very huge, especially between the 200 meter to 300 meter range. So the differentiation among the kind of earthquake-proof requirement is not very significant. Then you should also look at the soil and the geographical conditions. Actually, Beijing has a very good foundation on the ground, but in Shanghai, the soil may be softer. And so in Shanghai, you have to burden some cost premium. But in Beijing, some of the projects have like 4 levels going underground because of the harder soil and the land conditions out there. Overall speaking, between the 200 meter and the 300 meter range, and between the 6 degree and to 8 degree, yeah, there will be some cost difference between Beijing and the Shanghai projects between this kind of height range, but the difference will not be very substantial. As far as investment is concerned, you're going to also have to look at the local environment, the economic conditions. Then you can judge how much rent you can collect in the future.
However, when the height range goes beyond the level of 500 meters, and then the cost difference will be a lot higher. For example, the Beijing latest project with a plant height more than 500 meters.
Yes, ask again. Ask another question. Okay.
May I ask this question to Professor Lee, to you?
Me?
Yeah. Interestingly, the central business districts in China, there must be a big difference between the nighttime population and the daytime population. Like where we are today, how many times is the daytime population higher than the nighttime population? How many people come here in the morning and get out in the evening? Because the population we get, it's all nighttime populations, the figures we get today.
It depends the location, I think. For example, at the Lujiazui area, because that area is, I think, is the CBD area, I think, of Shanghai. And that area, the daytime population should be very high, probably 10 times, 10 times of night population. Yes, here. But if an area, for example, mainly for people, for residents, the nighttime population probably is higher than daytime for residence area. Yeah. But I'm not the expert. I'm not the expert in this area. I'm a structural engineer. Any people can answer this question for especially the urban planner of Shanghai. Yes.
What is the heart of your question? Is it about transportation?
Yeah, it's a big imbalance between daytime and nighttime population in central business districts. Like Makati in Metro Manila, the Philippines, the central business district is 11, the daytime population is 11 times the nighttime population. So it's so access limited, the big imbalance.
Okay, the final question. Yes. Okay. That one. The final question.
My name is Ming Zhang from Institute Architecture. This question is for both Jimmy and Mr. Jia. And I know Eugene pretty well. When I designed China Construction Bank in Xiamen, next to Eugene's site, still the tallest, one of the tallest buildings in Xiamen. Question is, we all know urban mixed-use development is a major investment and a long-term investment. So, and sustainable design is not only good for the human society, but also probably good for you as owner in terms of long-term return. How much both of your firms are committed to the sustainable design in your tall building?
All right. It is not very easy to respond to this question. And when we are doing a project, whether we need to consider it in a short term or in a long term, as far as return is concerned, there are a lot of uncertainties, for example, with economic growth. And the project may also be affected by a lot of external factors. So the environment is very complicated. It's hard for you to judge on the environment conditions. So when we try to work on a project, first, in order to make the project successful, to be frank, we're not even clear for whom we're doing or making the project. All right, thank you. Yeah, I can make some additional comments. How can I put it? From economic investment perspective, on the early stage, you may hold the property. Then you look at economic return. Objectively speaking, it is very hard for you to get the payback in 10 or 15 years if you totally hold the property at your own hand. You look at the hotels around the world. There are very limited number of those projects you can receive the investment payback within 10 to 15 years. Maybe Jinmao is one of the exceptions because of the Shanghai economic development. You look at Evergrande, and why Evergrande now is also running a football club. They have to consider some other complicated factors. Second, in terms of the Supertall buildings, in Greenland, part of our properties is sold, part of our properties is leased. The same holds true for Global Financial Center, also nearby. And a part of their property is sold, and a part is leased, so as to strike a balance in terms of their capital cost. And then in terms of sustainability, you have to make sure that the sustainability part investment can be reasonable, not to go to the extreme. And we do not only look at the lowest cost possible. We do not pursue those high-hanging fruit neither. So we just want to strike a balance. And sometimes you need to care about sustainability, but you're not supposed to overshoot the target. Please do not blindly pursue the LEED gold certification. Then you spare no effort and no cost in pursuing that. And maybe you are a car owner. When you have a certain income level, you may purchase a 200,000 car, or in the future, you will change your existing car and buy a 1 million RMB kind of a car. You have to do it face by face. So in terms of sustainability, you can invest a certain amount of money into sustainability, then that is enough. Then by next phase, you can upgrade. You cannot consider the future 100 years in a nutshell.
Before closing the session, I want to present gifts from CTBUH to speakers. So our appreciation.